Trump and the American Collective Psyche by Thomas Singer, M.D. While I join with those who believe that we need to question Donald Trump's psychological fitness to be president, my focus is less on individual psychopathology than on the interface between Trump and the American collective psyche. There are ways in which Trump mirrors, even amplifies, our collective attention deficit disorder, our sociopathy, and our narcissism. Therefore, this is less about diagnosing a public figure than about recognizing our own pathology. Trump has mesmerized our national psyche like no other public figure in recent memory. There is no doubt that his appeal, his wealth, power, celebrity status, and his brash willingness to shoot from the hip resonates powerfully with the collective psyche of many Americans, while these same qualities are repulsive to many others. The more vulgar, bullying, impulsive, and self-congratulatory Trump's behavior and rhetoric, the more some people worship him, while others fervently denounce him as a grave danger to our republic. To probe the profound collective disturbance that Trump activates and symbolizes, I draw on my experience as a psychiatrist and a Jungian psychoanalyst. A psychological theory about Trump's appeal, a marriage of the shadow, archetypal defenses, and the self at the group level of the psyche to form a cultural complex. You don't need to be a psychologist or psychiatrist to see that Donald Trump has a problem of narcissism. Ted Cruz announced on May 3, 2016, the day of the Indiana Republican presidential primary, that Trump was, quote, a pathological liar, utterly amoral, a narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen, and a serial philanderer, end quote. In a series of papers and books written over the past decade, I have developed a working model of the theory of cultural complexes that may be useful for understanding Trumpism. I will be talking about the psyche of the group, what lives inside each of us as individual carriers of the group psyche, and what lives between us in our shared group psyche. The group psyche engages with themes and conflicts that are not the same as our more personal psychological struggles. I hypothesize a direct link between Trump's personal narcissism and the collective psyche of those American citizens who embrace his perception of America and who feel that he understands and speaks to them. This is not a political analysis. It is a psychological analysis of what we can think of as the group psyche, which contributes enormously to and fuels political processes. This analysis is based on the notion that there are certain psychological energies, even structures, at the level of the cultural or group psyche that are activated at times of heightened threats to the core identity of the group, what we might think of as the group self. Three of these most important energies structures are 1, the shadow, 2, archetypal defenses of the group self, and 3, the group self itself. These energy structures take shape around social, political, economic, geographic, and religious themes that are alive in specific contexts and with particular contents. This same type of analysis may currently apply in the Brexit crisis in Great Britain or in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, with very different contexts and contents in which various groups can be seen as protecting their threatened or wounded self from being further injured by pursuing a defensive, aggressive attack against imagined or real dangerous enemies. What is it about Trump that acts as an irresistible magnet with ferocious attraction or repulsion? Is Trump the end product of our culture of narcissism? Is he what we get and deserve because he epitomizes the god or gods we currently worship in our mindless, consumerist, hyper-indulged cult of continuous stimulation and entertainment. Here is how Christopher Hedges states it in Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. Quote, "An image-based culture communicates through narratives, pictures, and pseudodrama. Scandalous affairs, hurricanes, untimely deaths, train wrecks, these events play well on computer screens and television. International diplomacy, labor union negotiations, and convoluted bailout packages do not yield exciting personal narratives or stimulating images. Reality is complicated. Reality is boring. We are incapable or unwilling to handle its confusion. We become trapped in the linguistic prison of incessant repetition. We are fed words and phrases like war on terror, or pro-life, or change. And within these narrow parameters, all complex thought, ambiguity, and self-criticism vanish." End quote. In addition to our collective inability to sort out illusion from reality, our culture gets further hopelessly entangled with our cult of celebrity. Hedges does not spare us the dire consequences of our intoxication with celebrity, which both fuels the split between illusion and reality while simultaneously filling the gap between the two. Quote, "Celebrity culture plunges us into a moral void. No one has any worth beyond his or her appearance, usefulness, or ability to succeed. The highest achievements in a celebrity culture are wealth, sexual conquest, and fame. It does not matter how these are obtained. We have a right in the cult of the self to get whatever we desire. We can do anything, even belittle and destroy those around us, including our friends, to make money, to be happy, and to become famous. Once fame and wealth are achieved, they become their own justification, their own morality." End quote. It seems clear that Trump's narcissism and his attacks on political correctness dovetail with deep needs in a significant portion of the American population to enhance their dwindling sense of place in America and of America's place in the world. Trump's narcissism can be seen as a perfect compensatory mirror for the narcissistic needs and injuries of those who support him. Or stated another way, there is a good fit. With this general formulation in mind, I analyze how Trump's presidency speaks to three highly intertwined parts of the American group psyche. 1. A woundedness at the core of the American group self. 2. The defenses mobilized in the groups that feel wounded, who wish to protect against further injury to the shared group self. And 3. The promise or hope of a cure for the wound. 1. A wound to the American group self. There is a wound at the core of the American group self spirit that is deeply felt by many, especially by those who have not participated in our nation's prosperity, and by others who are relatively well off but are keenly aware that our system of government and our way of life are threatened at the core of our collective being. Here is a working definition of the group self or spirit that I put forth in an earlier paper. Quote, "The group spirit is the ineffable core beliefs or sense of identity that binds people together, that is known to its members through a sense of belonging, shared essential beliefs, core historical experiences of loss and revelation, deepest yearnings and ideals. One can begin to circle around the nature of a group spirit by asking questions such as, what is most sacred to the group? What binds the group's members together?" End quote. Many in our country, on the left, right, and in the center, feel that this stage in our history is less secure than earlier stages. This nervousness about our essential well-being is deeply felt by the progressive left, by the conservative right, and by all those who feel alienated and angered by the current leaders of all branches of government, whom they see as destroying the country, whether the archenemy be Donald Trump of the Republicans or Hillary Clinton of the Democrats. On the right, the threat of terrorism, Muslims, immigrants, Mexicans, the global economy, China and international trade agreements, or progressives, are seen as leading us to the brink. On the left, the threats to a sense of well-being and security in our national group self come as the result of the growing disparity in the distribution of wealth and income, the mistreatment of vulnerable minorities of different races, colors, ethnicities, sexual identities, or genders, our power relationships to other countries around the world, and of course the maltreatment of the environment. I postulate that these threats are amplified on all sides by an even deeper, less conscious threat that I call extinction anxiety. Extinction anxiety exists both in the personal and group psyche and is based on the fear of the loss of supremacy by white Americans of the United States, the loss of America's place in the world as we have known it, and ultimately the destruction of the environment and the world itself. One might think of extinction anxiety as the cultural psyche's equivalent of death anxiety in the individual. For instance, climate change deniers on the right may be seen as denying the very real possibility of the planet's destruction as a way of defending themselves against the fear of extinction. Aligning himself with this attitude, Trump offers to dispel extinction anxiety by denying it is real and appointing a well-known climate change denier as the head of the EPA. Denial, whether at the individual or group level, is the most primitive defense the mind employs to protect itself from psychic pain. Here is how Joseph Epstein has described the injury to the group self-spirit of those attracted to Trump. Quote, "Something deeper, I believe, is rumbling behind the astounding support for Mr. Trump, a man who, apart from his large but less than pure business success, appears otherwise entirely without qualification for the presidency. I had a hint of what might be behind the support for him a few weeks ago when, on one of the major network news shows, I watched a reporter ask a woman at a Trump rally why she was supporting him. A thoroughly respectable-seeming middle-class woman, she replied without hesitation, 'I want my country back.' I don't believe that this woman is a racist or that she yearns for immigrants, gays, and other minorities to be suppressed, or even that she truly expects to turn back the clock on social change in the U.S. What she wants is precisely what she says, her country back. She couldn't any longer bear to watch the United States on the descent, hostage to progressivist ideas that bring neither contentment nor satisfaction, but instead foster a state of perpetual protest and agitation, anger, and tumult. So great is the frustration of Americans who do not believe in these progressivist ideas, who see them as ultimately tearing the country apart, that they are ready to turn, in their near hopelessness, to a man of Donald Trump's patently low quality." End quote. The self or group spirit of America is built on more than 300 years of progress, success, achievement, resourcefulness, and ingenuity, accompanied by almost endless opportunity and good fortune. We love and believe in our heroic potential, our freedom and independence, our worship of height and speed, youth, newness, technology, our optimism, and eternal innocence. We have enjoyed the profound resilience of the American spirit, which has shown itself repeatedly through very difficult historical trials, including our Civil War, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Vietnam War, the 9/11 attacks, the Iraq War, the financial collapse in 2008, and other major crises, including the one we may be in now. As a country, we have been blessed in our capacity to transcend loss, failure, and the threat of defeat in the face of crisis time and time again. And this has contributed to a positive vision of ourselves that has been fundamentally solid at the core for a long time. Of course, that self-image is subject to inflation, arrogance, and a morphing into hubris, in which we believe in our own exceptionalism and are blind to our causing grave injury to peoples at home and abroad. It is quite possible that Trump's personal inflation, arrogance, and hubris represent a compensatory antidote in our group psyche that is beginning to suffer severe self-doubt about our ability to navigate a highly uncertain future, the nostalgic longing of which is perfectly articulated in the phrase, "I want my country back." 2. Archetypal defenses of the group self. A significant number of people in our society feel cut off from what they believe to be their inherited, natural birthright as American citizens. Although they would not use this language, they are suffering a wound and threat at the level of the group self, even as they are also suffering individually. We can think of this as a narcissistic injury at the group level. I suggest that Trump has somehow intuited that injury and is playing to it, both as a self-proclaimed carrier of the group renewal and as a defender against those who would do further harm to it, be they terrorists, immigrants, Washington political insiders, the established Republican Party, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, James Comey, or anyone else who gets in Trump's way. Trump's embrace of the shadow of political correctness. Trump's particular political genius in the 2016 presidential election cycle was to launch his campaign with an attack on political correctness. With incredible manipulative skill, Trump's call to arms, "Get him out of here," made its first appearance at his rallies when he urged the faithful in his crowds to get rid of protesters. "Get him out of here" also seems to be his pledge to rid the country of Mexicans, Muslims, and other groups that are being portrayed as dangerous threats to the American way of life. Trump's strategy has been shrewd. He sensed that political correctness could be the trigger word and target for unleashing potent levels of shadow energies that have been accumulated in the cultural unconscious of the group psyche. He rode a huge wave of pent-up resentment, racism, and hatred long enough to crush all opponents and become the President of the United States. The notion of a trigger word activating a complex goes back to Jung's early word association tests, in which certain words detonated powerful emotions contained within personal complexes, such as the mother or father complex. Skillful politicians can trigger cultural or group complexes by a collective word association process that then takes on a life of its own. Trump is at his best when he is at his most awful. His willingness to be politically incorrect became a sign, to many, of his truth-telling. Amid a most dangerous battle between the alternative facts of the alt-right and fake news of the left, came an outpouring of the paranoia and hostility embedded in the cultural complex of those who loathe the deep state. Collective emotion is the only truth that matters. A group caught up in a cultural complex has highly selective memory, if any historical memory at all, and chooses only those historical and contemporary facts that validate their pre-existing opinion. Evidence of this is that no matter what Trump does or how many lies he tells, his base remains steadfast in its support of him, as the polls tell us. This kind of shadow energy is available for exploitation if a group that previously saw itself as having a solid place in American society, such as white middle-class Americans in the Rust Belt or coal miners in West Virginia, finds itself marginalized and drifting downward both socially and economically. How easy it is for such a group to see recent immigrants to this country as stealing the American dream from them. Here is how George Orwell, in his novel 1984, imagined the exploitation of those most subject to intoxication with an authoritarian leader like Trump. Quote, "In a way, the worldview of the party imposed itself most successfully on people incapable of understanding it. They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they never fully grasped the enormity of what was demanded of them. They simply swallowed everything." End quote. Donald Trump uncovered a huge sinkhole of dark, raw emotions in the national psyche for all of us to see. Rage, hatred, envy, and fear surfaced in a forgotten, despairing, growing white underclass who had little reason to believe that the future would hold the promise of a brighter, life-affirming purpose. Trump tapped into the negative feelings that many Americans have about all the things we are supposed to be compassionate about: ethnic, racial, gender, and religious differences. What a relief, so many must have thought, to hear a politician speak their unspoken resentments and express their rage. Trump tapped into the dirty little secret of their loathing of various minorities, even though we may all be minorities now. Trump's formula for repairing these deep wounds had him chanting around the country the hopeful mantra of making better deals. Once the complex takes over the narrative, or the narrative gives voice to the complex's core, facts simply become irrelevant. Inevitably, this leads to the kind of terrifying 1984 scenario in which, quote, "the Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary hypocrisy. They are deliberate exercises in doublethink. If human equality is to be forever averted, if the high, as we have called them, are to keep their places permanently, then the prevailing mental condition must be controlled insanity." Trump's cabinet appointments strongly suggest that this is what is happening in our country. The job of each new cabinet leader is to reverse or dismantle the very reason for which his or her department exists. Unholy marriage of shadow, archetypal defenses of the group self, and the group self. What makes Trump's unleashing of the shadow in the American psyche even more dangerous is that these energies become linked or even identical with what I call archetypal defenses of the group spirit. Quote, "When this part of the collective psyche is activated, the most primitive psychological forces come alive for the purpose of defending the group and its collective spirit or self." I capitalize self because I want to make it clear that it is not just the persona or ego identity of the group that is under attack, but something at an even deeper level of the collective psyche which one might think of as the spiritual home or God of the group. The tribal spirit of the clan or of the nation often lies dormant or in the background, but when it is threatened, the defenses mobilized to protect it are ferocious and impersonal. The mobilization of such potent, archaic defenses is fueled by raw collective emotion and rather simplistic, formulaic ideas and or beliefs that dictate how the group will think, feel, react, and behave. End quote. These activated archetypal defenses of the group spirit find concrete expression in forms as varied as the unrest of divided populations over the legal status of foreign immigrants in countries around the world, the threatened development of nuclear weapons by nation-states such as Iran or North Korea, the deployment of suicide bombers by terrorist groups, or the launching of massive military expeditions by world powers. And these same kinds of archetypal defenses come alive in all sorts of skirmishes between diverse groups of people who perceive their most sacred values in jeopardy. The LGBTQ community, blacks, Latinos, white men, women, the Christian right in the United States, Jews around the world, the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Middle East. The list of groups threatened at the core of their being or at the level of the group self seems endless. What makes Trump's narcissism so dangerous in its mix of shadow, his attacks on all sorts of groups of people, and self elements, his self-aggrandizing, inflated sense of himself and those for whom he pretends to speak, is that it plays to the unholy marriage of self and the aggressive, hateful, and violent elements in the collective psyche. Trump's example gives permission for shadowy thoughts, feelings, and actions on behalf of the self. This underlying group dynamic explains the comparison of Trump to Hitler. Evoking an archaic image of the German self, Hitler mobilized the most shadowy forces in modern history in the so-called service of that self-image, which centered on the supremacy of the Aryan race. First the brown shirts, then the Gestapo, SS, and other forces of the Third Reich, including its highly efficient bureaucracy. Trump seems to be toying with the collective shadow, encouraging its acting out in the name of the self. It is hard to imagine Trump leading the United States in the same direction that Hitler led Germany. I certainly hope I don't live to regret writing these words. But the dynamic is still terrifying. From a Jungian perspective, when the shadowy defenses of the group spirit and the group self closely align, there is great danger of violence, tyranny, and absolutism, especially with an authoritarian leader and a citizenry responsive to authoritarianism. 3. Curing the wounded self of America. Trump's selfie and America's selfie. The third and final component of this intertwined triad of forces in the group psyche is Trump's implicit promise of providing a cure for the wound at the level of the group self. This is where his narcissism is most prominent and most dangerous. The unconscious equation can be stated as follows. Quote, I am the greatness to which America may once again aspire. By identifying with how great I am, you can rekindle your wounded American dream and make yourself and America great again. Unquote. Or even more bluntly, quote, I have achieved the American dream. I am the American dream. I am the incarnation of the self that the country aspires to, end quote. This is, of course, a massive inflation. Trump's identification of his personal being with the self of America is his source of demagogic appeal. He is encouraging those who have lost a foothold in the American dream to place their trust in him as a mirror of their own potential, a potential that he has already achieved. Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, characterizes his magnetic appeal. Quote, I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they can still get very excited by those who do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. End quote. Trump has managed to cultivate and catch the projection of a powerful and successful person who, by virtue of his alleged business acumen and ability to negotiate, is able to make things happen for his own betterment, though rarely for the betterment of others, despite his false claims of giving generously to charities and creating untold jobs. You, too, can be like me, aggressive, successful, big, powerful, he is saying. This is the narcissism of Trump joining with the injured narcissism of those Americans who have seen their chances for well-being and security rapidly slip away. Trump celebrates the materialistic, power version of the American dream, of the big man who has made himself rich and powerful through the strength of his personality. He is free to speak his own mind and to pursue without limits his own self-aggrandizing goals that he equates with those of America. The negative aspects of Trump's narcissism strike those who are repelled by him, both at home and abroad, as a symbolic mirror of everything negative about a culture of narcissism. For many, he's become the very embodiment of everything bad about America, a self-promoting brand, an arrogant bully bursting with hubris, gross insensitivities to others' needs, possession by consumerism and greed, and entitlement and good fortune, which we have come to believe is our natural due. These are core characteristics of an American cultural complex that betrays that best self or spirit on which the nation and its Constitution were founded. Trump's narcissism is a perfect mirror of our national and even personal narcissism. Ultimately, I believe that the Trump phenomena is less about Trump than about us, about who we are as a people. The elephant in the room turns out to be we, the people of the United States. How terrifying to think that our politics and our lives today have gotten horribly confused with reality TV, social media, computer and cell phone technology, and their infinite capacity to turn reality into illusion, self into narcissism. Conclusion: groping the American psyche and psychic contagion. There are so many potentially destructive consequences of the emerging Trump presidency on the climate, on minorities, on immigrants, on women's rights, on the integrity of the Constitution, and on our relationships with China, Russia, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and even our own allies. But one of the most disturbing thoughts about the Trump presidency is that he has taken up residence not just in the White House, but in the psyches of each and every one of us. We are going to have to live with him rattling around inside of us, all of us at the mercy of his impulsive and bullying whims, as he lashes out at whatever gets under his skin in the moment with uninformed, inflammatory barbs. The way a president lives inside each of us can feel like a very personal and intimate affair. Those who identify with Trump and love the way he needles the elites, whom they fear, envy, and despise, may relish the fact that he lives inside of us as a tormentor. Trump is well versed in brutally toying with his enemies, who include women, professionals, the media, the educated classes, and minorities, to mention just a few. What most frightens me about Trump is his masterful skill at invading and groping the national psyche. Many tired of the Clintons taking up permanent residence in our national psyche. Trump will soon put the Clintons to shame in his capacity to dwell in and stink up our collective inner space, like the proverbial houseguest who overstays his welcome. And many of us never invited Trump into our psychic houses in the first place. That is perhaps why the image that has stayed with me the most from the national disgrace that was our election process in 2016 is that of the woman who came forward to tell her story of allegedly being sexually harassed by Trump. Some years ago, she was given an upgrade to first class on a plane and found herself sitting next to the Donald. In no time at all, she says, he was literally groping her all over, breasts and below. She describes the physicality of the assault as akin to being entangled in the tentacles of an octopus, and she was barely able to free herself and retreat to economy class. It now feels as though we have all been groped by the tentacles of Trump's octopus-like psyche, which has invaded our own and threatens to tighten its squeeze for several years. To put it as vulgarly as Trump himself might, Trump has grabbed the American psyche by the pussy. As we slowly collect ourselves after the devastating and unexpected tsunami of Trump winning the presidency and the roller coaster ride of his early days as president, many are finding renewed energy and commitment to challenge his shadowy agenda in new and creative ways. I hope that in a deep resurgence of activism to reclaim our most cherished and threatened American values, we will resist our tendency to cocoon ourselves in a self-righteous, arrogant bubble of narcissistic ideals, even in the name of being progressive.
Thomas Singer, MD, is a psychiatrist and Jungian psychoanalyst practicing in San Francisco. In addition to private practice, he has served on Social Security's Hearing and Appeals Mental Impairment Disability Team. His interests include studying the relationships among myth, politics, and psyche in The Vision Thing and the Ancient Greece Modern Psyche series. He is the editor of a series of books exploring cultural complexes, including Placing Psyche, Listening to Latin America, Europe's Many Souls, The Cultural Complex, and a book in preparation on Asia. He is the current president of National ARIS, an archive of symbolic imagery that has created the Book of Symbols.
Who Goes Trump? Tyranny as a Triumph of Narcissism by Elizabeth Micah. Tyrannies are three-legged beasts. They encroach upon our world in a steady creep, more often than overcome it in a violent takeover, which may be one reason they are not always easy to spot before it is too late to do much about them. Their necessary components, those three wobbly legs, are the tyrant, his supporters, the people, and the society at large that provides a ripe ground for the collusion between them. Political scientists call it the toxic triangle. The force binding all three is narcissism. It animates the beast while, paradoxically and not, eating it alive, bringing its downfall in due time. This force and its influences, which knit the beast into such a powerful and destructive entity, remain invisible to us for reasons that are clearly hinted at, but somehow continue to evade our individual and collective comprehension. They make sure we don't recognize the tyranny's marching boots, which can be heard from miles away and months away, until they show up on our doorstep. And that's despite the fact that this very same process has repeated itself countless times in history. We have known who tyrants are and how tyrannies form since antiquity, and this knowledge has been supported by the ever-growing tragic evidence of the tyranny's effects on humanity. Yet, despite making promises to ourselves and one another to never forget, we seem not to remember or not to know, always with devastating consequences. Our forgetting stems partly from miseducation and partly from denial. It gives us clues to the kind of work, psychological, social, political, and economic, that we must do if we are to avoid the self-destruction promised by tyrannies today. Let's take a look at tyranny's components and their interactions. The tyrant. Tyrants come in different shapes and sizes, and depending on perspective, various writers stress similarities or differences among them. This paper will not delve into those classifications, but rather attempt to simplify and maybe even illuminate their most salient common features. Although the terms dictator and tyrant are used interchangeably, it makes sense perhaps to stress that not all dictators are tyrants. Tyrants are dictators gone bad. A leader may start as a seemingly benevolent dictator but turn into a tyrant as his reign progresses, becoming ruthlessly destructive with time, something we have seen repeatedly in history. All tyrants share several essential features. They are predominantly men with a specific character defect, narcissistic psychopathy, also known as malignant narcissism. This defect manifests in a severely impaired or absent conscience and an insatiable drive for power and adulation that masks the conscience deficits. It forms the core of attraction between him and his followers, the essence of what is seen as his charisma. In his seminal paper on antisocial personality disorder and pathological narcissism in prolonged conflicts and wars of the 21st century, Frederick Burkle observes that narcissism augments and intensifies the pathological features of a psychopathic character structure, making those endowed with it especially dangerous. not in the least because of their ability to use manipulative charm and a pretense of human ideals to pursue their distinctly primitive goals. We talk about the chief feature of narcissistic psychopathy, the impairment of conscience, and its destructive consequences, in The Unbearable Lightness of Being a Narcissist. Impulsive, sensation-seeking, and incapable of experiencing empathy or guilt, a narcissistic psychopath treats other people as objects of need fulfillment and wish fulfillment. This makes it easy for him to use and abuse them in his personal relationships and in large-scale actions without compunction. His lack of conscience renders him blind to higher human values, which allows him to disregard them entirely, or treat them instrumentally as means to his ends, the same way he treats people. This dangerous character defect, however, serves him well in the pursuit of power, money, and adulation. Not having the inhibitions and scruples imposed by empathy and conscience, he can easily lie, cheat, manipulate, destroy, and kill if he wants to, or when powerful enough, order others to do it for him. The characteristics indicative of narcissistic psychopathy are observable already in childhood. Biographies of tyrants note the early manifestations of vanity, sensation-seeking, and impulsivity, often accompanied by poor self-control, aggression and callousness, manipulativeness, and a strong competitive drive and desire to dominate, coexistent with the lack of empathy and conscience. Plato remarked on the spirited character of a future tyrant, showing the above-mentioned symptoms already in his youth. Another common but not universal biographical finding is a history of childhood abuse. Here, however, accounts vary. For example, while some, like Miller, stress Hitler's purported severe abuse at the hands of his stepfather, others note that his childhood was uneventful in this respect. Biographies can be incomplete or tendentious, intentionally and not, and so it is not always possible to verify the truth. It is impossible to rule out narcissistic upbringing as being involved in raising a future tyrant, creating a narcissistic injury that shapes the child's life and sets him on a path of repairing it through a ruthless and often sadistic pursuit of power and adulation, even when there is no evidence of overt abuse and/or neglect in his biographical data. While the exact causes of this character defect are a matter of speculation, their possible origins offer intriguing possibilities explaining their clinical manifestations. For example, a narcissistic injury in the first years of a child's life could possibly impair development of the object constancy capacity. This results in an inability to grasp and adhere to the solidity of facts, and consequently in a disregard for the truth and other human values, the understanding of which comprises a large part of our conscience. The narcissistic psychopath's propensity to lie, whether on purpose to achieve a specific result, or seemingly effortlessly to invent a universe of alternative facts that just happen to affirm his grandiose and guiltless image of himself, could be a result of that impaired object constancy capacity. His lack of empathy, whether resulting from an inborn cause or narcissistic authoritarian upbringing, would further or separately limit development of his conscience and influence not only the child's socio-emotional development, but also his cognitive capacities, resulting in what Burkle calls being smart but not bright. Dombrowski termed this as one-sided development, where intelligence and certain cognitive skills develop more or less normally, but one's emotional growth remains stunted. The capacity for emotional development is crucial, as this is the only kind of growth possible throughout our lifespan, expanding and deepening our conscience and spurring us to learning and a meaningful change. Whether the developmental arrest typical for this form of pathology is inborn, acquired, or a combination of both nature and nurture, it results in the narrow and inflexible character structure, with intelligence subsumed under primitive drives for power, sex, and adulation. As Dombrowski writes, a psychopath is emotionally rigid and narrow. He has strong ambitions and significant talents, but they remain narrow and under the influence of primitive drives. He does not experience inner conflicts, but instead he creates external ones. He is not capable of empathy, and so he strives to gain control over others. Or, before he can gain dominance, he submits to the control of others. He is usually deaf and blind to the problems of others, to their development and developmental difficulties. He relentlessly realizes his own goals. A psychopath exists on the level of primary integration and is emotionally stunted. We can distinguish small and big psychopaths. We find the big ones among the most notorious world criminals and among aggressive tyrants and dictators like Nero or Hitler, who do not hesitate to sacrifice others for their own goals. For a big psychopath, a person and a social group do not have any moral value. To him, rules of justice do not exist. Genocide or concentration camps are not a moral problem for him, but a means to an end. Small psychopaths are miniatures of the big ones. In general, they submit to big psychopaths in the right circumstances. A small psychopath looks for opportunities to realize his own interest and to satisfy his desire to wreak havoc in society. A psychopath thinks that laws are to be broken and that they do not apply to him. He uses any circumstances to secure his position, money, and fortune, regardless of the consequences for others, without any consideration for ethical norms. Psychopaths do not know how to emotionally compare themselves with others. They cannot emotionally understand others, and they lack an empathic attitude. The individual distinctions between small and big psychopaths, also known as tyrants, appear to lie predominantly in the level of their narcissism, observed by Burkle, but also in the presence of some socially approved skills, an ability to modulate and or mask their aggressive impulses and deeds, as well as life opportunities and luck. A narcissistic psychopath without sufficiently developed self-control or advantageous life opportunities may turn into a mass killer whose crimes will land him in prison before his grandiose dreams of power and domination come to fruition. Narcissistic psychopaths turned tyrants possess the right combination of manipulativeness, self-control, and intelligence to convince others to support them long enough to put their grandiose ideas to work on a large scale. They also appear to possess skills that are seen as charisma, the most frequent of which is the ability to deliver public speeches that inspire others to follow them. More often than not, however, this charisma is simply their ability to tell others what they want to hear, that is, to lie, to make them go along with whatever scheme they have concocted for the moment. Their glibness is something that easily fools normal people who do not understand the kind of pathology that results from a missing conscience. Once in positions of power, tyrants can fully unleash their sadism under the cloak of perverted ideals which they peddle as a cover for their primitive drives. Instead of turning into common criminals condemned by society, they become oppressors and or murderers of thousands or millions, with their atrocities always justified in their own minds and those of their supporters. This is why Pol Pot could say without hesitation, "You can look at me. Am I a savage person? My conscience is clear," even though he was directly responsible for the deaths of millions of his compatriots. Tyrants identify with other tyrants and find inspiration in their successes while remaining oblivious to their failures. They recognize and respect power as much as they are envious of and despise its wielders. The greater and more ruthless the living or historical tyrant, the bigger an inspiration he is for aspiring ones. His disdain for morality and law and his unbridled aggression in pursuit of power appeal to the tyrant in the making, and form a template for his behavior, showing him what is possible. On the eve of invading Poland in 1939, Hitler, after issuing orders to mercilessly and without pity annihilate every man, woman, and child of Polish ethnicity and language, spoke admiringly of one such role model. Genghis Khan had sent millions of women and children to their deaths, and did so consciously and with a happy heart. History sees in him only the great founder of states. Then he exhorted his subordinates in Poland to be hard, spare nothing, act faster and more brutally than the others, and they eagerly obliged. The upcoming tyrant dreams of becoming as great as, and preferably greater than, his favorite tyrannical role models. And if those role models are alive, the tyrant in the making can be expected to curry favor with the existing ones, while plotting their demise and besting them in the tyrant's world rankings. To accomplish this, though, he must obtain a position of ultimate power within his own nation first. This brings us to the second leg of the tyrannical beast. The tyrant's supporters. The process through which the tyrant gains popularity and power usually baffles the outside observers and historians looking at it from the perspective of time. As its main ingredient, narcissism somehow remains invisible to both participants and observers. The tyrant's narcissism is the main attractor of his followers, who project their hopes and dreams onto him. The more grandiose his sense of his own self and his promises to his fans, the greater their attraction and the stronger their support. As Plato wrote in the Republic, the people have always some champion whom they set over them and nurse into greatness. Through the process of identification, the tyrant's followers absorb his omnipotence and glory and imagine themselves as powerful as he is, the winners in the game of life. This identification heals the followers' narcissistic wounds, but also tends to shut down their reason and conscience, allowing them to engage in immoral and criminal behaviors with a sense of impunity engendered by this identification. Without the support of his narcissistic followers, who see in the tyrant a reflection and vindication of their long-nursed dreams of glory, the tyrant would remain a middling nobody. The interplay of grandiose hopes and expectations between the tyrant in the making and his supporters that suffuses him with power and helps propel him to a position of political authority is an example of narcissistic collusion, a meshing of mutually compatible narcissistic needs. The people see in him their long-awaited savior and a father substitute, hinting at the narcissistic abuse implicated in the authoritarian upbringing that demands obedience and worship of the all-powerful parental figure. In their faith and unquestioning admiration, he in turn receives a ready line of narcissistic supply, thousands of mirrors reflecting his greatness. Describing the narcissistic collusion between the tyrant and his supporters, Erich Fromm stressed the elements of submission to and identification with the strongman. The highly narcissistic group is eager to have a leader with whom it can identify itself. The leader is then admired by the group, which projects its narcissism onto him. In the very act of submission to the powerful leader, which is in depth an act of symbiosis and identification, the narcissism of the individual is transferred onto the leader. The greater the leader, the greater the follower. Personalities who as individuals are particularly narcissistic are the most qualified to fulfill this function. The narcissism of the leader who is convinced of his greatness and who has no doubts is precisely what attracts the narcissism of those who submit to him. The half-insane leader is often the most successful one until his lack of objective judgment, his rage reaction in consequence to any setback, his need to keep up the image of omnipotence, may provoke him to make mistakes which lead to his destruction. But there are always gifted half-psychotics at hand to satisfy the demands of a narcissistic mass. Gerald Post underscored the authoritarian parenting aspect of that identification when discussing Hitler Youth. Especially for the Hitler Youth movement, which was at the forefront of Hitler's support, Hitler's externalizing hate-mongering rhetoric was a comforting and inspiring message, and Hitler provided the strong, inspiring father figure that these children could not find within their own families. But in rebelling against their own families, they submitted uncritically to Hitler's authoritarian leadership. Importantly, Adolf Hitler's unleashing of the demons of war was turning the passive humiliation of defeat in World War I into the active experience of redemptive action. The narcissistic mixture of elevated expectations, resentments, and desire for revenge on specific targets and/or society in general for not meeting those expectations is what sociologist Michael Kimmel called aggrieved entitlement. Although Kimmel talked specifically about white American men in the 21st century, some form of aggrieved entitlement has been driving tyrants and their supporters, as well as organized and lone wolf terrorists, the world over since time immemorial. The tyrant makes many good-sounding but also openly unrealistic, bordering on delusional, promises to his supporters, and usually has no intention or ability to fulfill most of them, if any. He holds his supporters in contempt as he does weaker human beings in general, and uses them only as props in his domination and adulation-oriented schemes. The narcissistic collusion between the tyrant and his supporters is also driven by the latter's need for revenge, for the tyrant is always chosen to perform this psychically restorative function, to avenge the humiliations, narcissistic wounds of his followers and punish those who inflicted them. However, as the wounds often date to the supporter's personal ancient past, and more often than not are perceived rather than real, the choice of the object of this vengeful punishment is not based on reality. Rather, it is based on the displacement and projection characteristic of the scapegoating process that becomes an inextricable part of the narcissistic collusion between the tyrant and his followers. The scapegoating designates the others as an object upon which the narcissistic revenge will be inflicted. The others always represent the split off, devalued, and repressed parts of the narcissistic individual's own psyche, which are projected onto them. These projections are shared and augmented through a narcissism of small differences, which allows us to focus on and enlarge insignificant differences between ourselves and the others, in order to solidify our negative projections and justify our contempt and aggression toward them. The tyrant and his followers typically choose as vessels for their negative projections and aggression the members of society who are not just different, but weaker. The tyrant fuels that aggression in order to solidify his power, but also to deflect it from himself, shield his own narcissism, and repair his own narcissistic injuries dating to his childhood. The figure of the narcissistic parental abuser, tyrant, is protected through the scapegoating and the return to the authoritarian, order and obedience-based mode of social functioning promised by the tyrant, as he himself assumes the mantle of father protector and directs his own and his supporters' aggression onto the others, who have nothing to do with those supporters' real and perceived wounds. The tyrant's own narcissism hints at the level of woundedness in his supporters. The greater their narcissistic injury, the more grandiose the leader required to repair it. While his grandiosity appears grotesque to non-narcissistic people who do not share his agenda, to his followers he represents all their denied and thwarted greatness, which now, under his rule, will finally flourish. Hitler's bizarre dream of a 1,000-year Reich, spread upon the world did not seem at all preposterous or dangerous to so many Germans suffering from the pain, humiliation, and privations inflicted upon them by the fiasco of World War I. Just as Stalin's vision of communism as dictatorship of the working class taking over the world did not appear strange or dangerous to his beleaguered followers. Narcissism is blind to itself. The natural consequence of scapegoating that stems from the projections of the narcissist's devalued parts of himself is dehumanization of the others, which then justifies all kinds of atrocities perpetrated on them. The ease with which this attitude spreads in narcissistic groups is frightening and indicative of a narcissistic rage that fuels it, a rage focused on purging psychically and physically all that is weak and undesirable from the narcissist's inner and external worlds. That rage, along with dreams of glory, is what makes the bond between the tyrant and his followers so strong that it remains impervious to reality. It also makes the tyrant's rule easier, as he does not have to exert himself much to infect his followers with contempt for the dehumanized others and incite aggression against them. In fact, the tyrant's permission for such aggression appears to be a large part of his appeal to his blood and revenge-thirsty followers. The tyrant's and his followers' projections always reveal much about their own pathology. In his private notes about Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland, Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote that they were not people anymore, but beasts of prey equipped with a cold intellect. The latter description obviously more applicable to Goebbels and the Nazis themselves than their victims, who, it must be stressed, were observed by Goebbels in captivity under dehumanizing conditions of ghetto life. Once we dehumanize the others and imbue them with a murderous motivation directed at us, we can easily rationalize any act of violence we perpetrate upon them as self-defense. And so removing en masse and without mercy those beasts of prey became one of the main goals of the Nazis, who believed that Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and other non-Aryans threatened their existence. The fear, whether genuine or faked, stemming from this false belief was used as a sufficient justification for mass murder on a scale unseen previously in the modern world. It must be noted that the tyrant's supporters, and especially sycophants within his closest circle, tend to share his character defect. The sycophantic echo chamber around the tyrant magnifies but also hides his pathology. His surrogates usually serve as ego substitutes to his rampaging id and are responsible for introducing and implementing his destructive plans in ways that would seem rational and acceptable to the public. Their role becomes more important with time as he psychologically decompensates, which inevitably happens to narcissistic psychopaths in positions of ultimate power. As his paranoia, grandiosity, and impulsivity grow, his aides, family members, and surrogates, fearful for their positions and often their lives, scramble to preserve an image of his normalcy and greatness for public consumption to the very end. Their loyalty can be fierce and undying, unlike that of the tyrant himself. The society. Tyrants do not arise in a vacuum, just as tyranny does not spring on the world unannounced. It takes years of cultivation of special conditions in a society for a tyranny to take over. Those conditions invariably include a growing and unbearably oppressive economic and social inequality ignored by the elites who benefit from it, at least for a time, fear, moral confusion, and chaos that come from that deepening inequality, a breakdown of social norms, and growing disregard for the humanity of a large portion of the population and for higher values. In effect, we could see that the pre-tyrannical societies, whether nominally democratic or based on other forms of political organization, exhibit signs of a narcissistic pathology writ large. Those involve the inevitable split into their grandiose and devalued parts, including those of the society's self-image, and a denial of their shadow, which is projected outward onto others. Oppressive, dehumanizing, narcissistic systems, like narcissists themselves, cultivate their delusions of superiority on the basis of that internal, unseen, and unspoken split between the grandiose, blameless I, us, and the devalued, inferior others. The others become repositories of the narcissist's repressed vices, just as the tyrant is the vessel for their grandiose beliefs about themselves. Another narcissistic aspect of such societies is the growing and ruthless competition, jealousy, and aggression within its borders, but also directed externally toward other nations in a scapegoating mechanism that is meant to prevent an internal breakdown of a society by redirecting its narcissistic rage onto external objects. Oftentimes, these vulnerable societies reel from some form of a narcissistic injury, such as the humiliation of a lost war, international sanctions, or treaties perceived as unfair, as Germany did after the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. None of these processes is openly acknowledged or even noticed by the members of the society, save by a few typically ignored Cassandras. Just as individual narcissists are incapable of experiencing guilt, taking responsibility for their vices, or making genuine efforts to set things right in their lives, narcissistic societies also persist in their self-destructive blindness. While the chaos and discord brew in their underclasses, the elites, ensconced in their narcissistic bubbles, remain oblivious to the suffering of their fellow citizens and the fate it portends for the nation. Fritz Stern has said that German moderates and German elites underestimated Hitler, assuming that most people would not succumb to his Manichaean unreason. They did not think that his hatred and mendacity could be taken seriously. Hitler was seen by many as a bombastic but harmless buffoon, while many others, including members of clergy, intellectual elites, and the wealthy, were nevertheless mesmerized by his grand visions of Germany's future glory and eagerly supported his agenda. Narcissism of the elites makes them as well blind to the encroaching tyranny. It is a convenient and yes, narcissistic myth that only the dispossessed and uninformed would support the tyrant. It is not the economic or educational status that determines such susceptibility, but one's narcissism, and that cuts across socio-economic strata. Dorothy Thompson describes it brilliantly in her 1941 essay Who Goes Nazi, in which she identifies those threads of frustrated grandiosity, resentments, and hatreds in the well-heeled individual's characters that make them fall for tyrannical ideologies and movements. She also observes those who would naturally resist the toxic pull of Nazism, noting their humility and depth. Stern quotes a letter from philosopher and Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who confessed to him that he had never believed in Nazi ideology, but he had been tempted by the movement, which seemed to him then like the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. On reflection, he thought that National Socialism had been part of a process that the National Socialists themselves had not understood. He may well have been right. The Nazis did not realize that they were part of a historic process in which resentment against a disenchanted secular world found deliverance in the ecstatic escape of unreason. Note that the process that the Nazis themselves had not understood is the very narcissistic collusion, a near psychotic infection with this virus of grandiosity and rage on a mass scale. It is rarely grasped, not even from the perspective of time, as our blindness makes it impossible to acknowledge it, which renders our narcissism the last taboo in a world that has dispensed with taboos. Our denial and social amnesia further entrench our incomprehension and ensure that history repeats itself. Part of our forgetting involves distortions of historical and psychological facts. Safely removed, time and distance-wise, from the latest tyranny-caused mayhem, we tend to imagine tyrants as instantly recognizable evil beings and tyrannies as something exotic enough never to happen to us. But as history and experience demonstrate, power-hungry narcissistic psychopaths do not look different from normal people. And if they stand out, it is often for socially approved reasons: their resolve, charisma, decisiveness, and ability to inspire others. No tyrant comes to power on the platform of genocidal tyranny, even though such ideas may be brewing already in the recesses of his mind. Each and every one of them promises to bring back law and order, create better economic conditions for the people, and restore the nation's glory. These empty promises, for the tyrant has little desire and even less ability to fulfill them, are always tied together with the thread of scapegoating others, a necessary component that channels the narcissistic rage outward and increases the society's cohesion. But the tyrant sows discord and division among his own peoples as well. He cannot help it. Pitting people against one another satisfies his irrepressible sadistic urge and makes it easier for him to dominate and control them. The tyrant shows up in a society that is already weakened by disorder, blind to it, and unable and/or unwilling to take corrective measures that would prevent a tyrannical takeover. Once he and his sycophantic cabal assume power, they deepen and widen the disorder, dismantling and changing the society's norms, institutions, and laws to fully reflect their own pathology. Andrew Łobachewski discusses at length the formation and progression of pathocracies, political and other systems run by characterologically impaired individuals, predominantly psychopaths and narcissists. He describes how pathocracies change the society by the introduction of paralogisms, ways of distorting reality and truth, and paramoralisms, methods of perverting moral values. Under tyranny, paralogisms and paramoralisms are unleashed on a large scale through various propagandist means that include repetition of flat-out lies, accompanied by denials and obfuscation served through the increasingly centralized and controlled media. Fortified by magical thinking and contempt for reason, these distortions lead to the creation of the kind of absurdist unreality well known to people raised in authoritarian regimes, where up is down and black is white, and where what one knows to be true may have nothing to do with the officially sanctioned version of the truth. We can see the tyrant's own pathology influencing every area of a society's functioning, from politics through culture and social mores to science and technology. What is being seen, said, and studied, and what's ignored and silenced, depends on the tyrant's whims, and soon enough the society itself and its ideology are structured in ways that meet his pathological needs for power and adulation. The implementation of this ideology is usually a gradual process, one that is eventually reinforced by the use of violence against persistent objectors. As freedom of speech, the press, and assembly disappears and the tyrant's destructive reforms take hold, an ethos of the new man, an ideal of a human being compatible with the disordered ideology, is forced upon the populace. This new man is a dehumanized caricature of a human person, usually exemplifying the tyrant's distorted views and thus meeting his pathological needs, mainly for dominance and adulation. He, we will use the male pronoun, but there is of course a compatible version of the new woman to go with the new man, is wholly devoted to the cause and the leader, which in tyrannies are often one and the same, an ultimate expression of the tyrant's narcissism, and acts in prescribed ways meant to demonstrate this devotion in his life. Hero worship and utmost loyalty become parts of the new man's prescribed behavior, reinforced by new laws and norms, but also by individuals who eagerly cooperate with the authoritarian rules by spying on and denouncing their fellow citizens' ideologically improper behavior. Our human propensity to submit to inhumane rules established by pathological authority cannot be overestimated. We have plenty of historical and contemporary evidence for it, as well as experimental data. An approving nod from an authority figure, no matter how insignificant or even real, can easily absolve us of responsibility in our minds and override any scruples imposed by our conscience, proving its perplexing malleability. The ease with which many so-called normal people shut down their conscience makes them not very different from functional psychopaths. This disturbing fact of human life is something the tyrant counts on when he establishes his reign. He knows that he can expect loyalty from his followers and successfully demand it from the majority of society. And those unwilling to follow his dictates and are actively opposing them will be eliminated. The new man's thoughts must of course change too, to better aid his transformation. Thus, the criteria of mental normalcy and pathology also are redefined, and psychology and psychiatry, like other branches of social science, are co-opted to serve the regime. What is considered normal, both in the sense of statistical norm and mental health, is in fact pathological, and mental health, defined as the capacity for multi-level and multi-dimensional development, is pathologized. The ease with which the tyrannical ideology spreads is always greater than we want to imagine. Our narcissistic blindness makes it impossible for us to believe that it could happen here, and that we too could be as susceptible to it as any other human beings in history. Tyranny feeds on the irrationality of narcissistic myths and magical thinking, even though its ideology may be disguised as hyper-rationalism, as was the case with communism. In this, it very much resembles the narcissistically psychopathic character of the tyrant himself. Solipsistic, withdrawn from reality, and full of grandiose and paranoid beliefs, impervious to the corrective influences of objective facts. These pathological factors ensure that eventually the tyrant's reign collapses. The inherent and violent irrationality, bereft of internal brakes that stem from a conscience, and unchecked by external forces, is the main reason tyrants and their regimes are doomed to fail. The growing malignancy, corruption, aggression, and oppression provokes opposition, which eventually brings the tyranny down, but not until its pillaging and violent reign create much human suffering. The reset of a society's mores that follows the tragic aftermath of a tyrannical rule usually leads to a greater appreciation for the importance of universal human values: equality, justice, truth, and compassion. But if care is not taken to implement these values in consistent practice, our narcissistic tendencies creep in and lead to social disorder, making us susceptible to tyranny again. Given our growing potential for self-destruction, the stakes go up with every tyrannical turn. Conclusion. Narcissism is as much a character problem as it is an error in our thinking. Seeing oneself as above is the general attitude of a narcissist toward the world, and the error of the tyrant and his followers. This error appears to grip many so-called civilized human societies, and is especially pronounced in those where inequality grows despite any official sloganeering to the contrary. Our narcissism is what gives rise to inequality, and inequality fuels our narcissism. The resultant suffering and despair, along with the desire for revenge, are among the necessary conditions for the emergence of tyranny. As Burkle observes, we are seeing a resurgence of tyrannical leaders around the globe, even in nations that supposedly have learned the lessons of tyranny's past in the most painful ways. It is a sign of our pressing need to reckon with our collective shadow. If we as a species are to flourish and prosper, we need to understand that our urgent and necessary task is to transcend and dismantle our narcissism, both individual and collective.
Elizabeth Micah, M.A., LCPC, of Gifted Resources in Northern Illinois, in the Chicago area, received her degree in clinical psychology from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. She specializes in assessment and counseling of gifted children and adults. Her professional interests include creativity and mental health, learning differences and learning styles, multiple exceptionalities, and emotional and moral development.